The daughter of Wichita's BTK serial killer speaks out. Plus, a crisis in Kansas prisons. That's what the new prison chief says about last year's riots. And the fight over itemizing your state income taxes moves to the next level. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. It's a battle over your tax bill that's been brewing since the beginning of the year. Plans to let you once again itemize your deductions, at least in Kansas, are one step closer to happening. Maybe. The Kansas Senate Thursday gave final approval to a bill designed to keep Kansas residents and businesses from paying higher taxes due to changes in federal laws. That's according to the Wichita Eagle. At the beginning of the year, Senate President Susan Wagle called it her top priority, even forming a special committee just to vet the bill. But the governor and Democrats say it's irresponsible to change the tax code at a time when the state's finances are already in flux. They're calling instead for a one-year moratorium on any tax changes. Many lawmakers expect if the bill passes the House as well, Governor Kelly will veto it. It did not have a veto-proof majority in the Senate. Taxes, the state's budget, capers, lots of complicated stuff on our plate today. Here to help us hash it all out, we have House Minority Leader Tom Sawyer, Democrat from Wichita, the head of the Taxation Committee. Split second there, almost forgot. In the House, State Representative Stephen Johnson, Republican from Assyria, and John Whitmer. Here is our analyst from the John Whitmer Show on KNSS. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So, as we talk about this bill, I don't think I've met anyone who's said that they didn't think Kansans should get the right to itemize their taxes back. It's been more a question of, can we afford it? So, as somebody who sits on the budget committees, both of you, and the tax committees, what is that looking like right now? Tom, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's too soon, and it's kind of pretty irresponsible. We've just begun undoing the Brownback tax experiment and getting our budget back in order. And we don't even know how much this windfall is, or if there really is one. I mean, the federal tax code, there are literally hundreds of changes to it. Some of those changes actually cut income to the state of Kansas. Some of them increase income to the state of Kansas. And we don't really know the effect. Taxpayers just began filing their taxes in January. And I'm kind of concerned when the very first revenue we get after people start filing, all of a sudden income tax receipts were down $50 million under the estimate in January. So there's a chance this is a negative number. But regardless, I do support the itemization piece, even though it really does affect a small number of taxpayers. Department of Revenue said in 2017, 14.2% of Kansans itemized their taxes. And because of the changes in the federal code, it'd only be 8.7% if we make no changes in 2018. So you're talking about 5.5% of Kansas. But I do think we ought to find a way to help them. But the bill that passed the Senate's a bad bill. 71% of the relief goes to large multinational corporations. I think we got to take our time, figure out what the windfall is, if there is some, and then figure out a way to give it back to all Kansans, either by lowering the sales tax on food or increasing the standard deduction, maybe including the itemization, those things that affect Kansans, rather than giving 71% away to large multinational corporations who are just going to take the money out of state.
Well, certainly we've got a lot of viewpoints here at this table. Stephen, what are you thinking?
Well, I have a little different take on it. I have great respect for Representative Sawyer's knowledge on tax, something that we have worked on specifically to the itemization piece. When we worked on the tax code 2 years ago, one of the things that we consciously did in Kansas was add back standard deductions. And we are working to get to that point where people would be able to itemize again. And we were only stepping into that. We were at 50%, 75, then the full 100% coming up in 2 years. And that was important to us in our tax policy. I believe that it still is. These are monies we had not planned on when we put the budget together. It was a surprise when the federal law came through and actually changed what was going to happen. So I think it is important for us to look at how we derive the monies that we get. If we need more money in the budget for whatever reasons, if the court in the lawsuit makes that decision and the people of Kansas agree with that, we need to make a decision actively of how we want to pay for that rather than letting that fall on any limited group. Representative Sawyer mentioned that it was, maybe 5% of the people. Is that really how we would want it to happen? That may mislead us a little in that with only 50% deduction is how we get to that 14%. As you play it out, it's probably closer to 20. if we were at 100% on itemized deductions. But I think it's really important that we take a hard look at that. As we play it further out, I don't fully understand who all will be impacted by the business expense deduction on interest expense. I think that could be some smaller businesses as well as larger businesses. That's one of the larger fiscal notes. When you boil that down, the repatriation is actually negligible after you get through the first year. It's a little bit in the first year and then not a lot. The global intangible piece is an ongoing one, but the key you want to look at there is what incentives do we want and how do we compare? Would we encourage a spirit to expand in Oklahoma rather than Wichita by being the highest in how we tax those types of incomes? We are among fewer than 6 states that tax it as highly as we do. I think we have to look at our competitive nature before we just allow something to automatically happen to a small group of taxpayers, whoever they are.
And John, I know you spend a lot of time talking to some of the same lawmakers that I do, but also talking to Kansans, particularly conservative Kansans who are interested in politics. What are you hearing from them about this topic?
You know, we've talked on my show about this quite a bit, and the metaphor we've used is the wallet on the street that you find, and it's not yours, and they're not returning it to the owner. This is theft straight out. This is not our money. It's not the state's money, rather. This is our money. And frankly, and you know, Tom and I are friends, and I love Tom. But I got to tell you, I am so tired of this end the Brownback experiment rhetoric that they use. Because what the truth is it's a $1.2 billion retroactive income tax increase. That's their end to the experiment. That's not an end that my listeners, and I think most Kansans, like. We saw that in the results in the last House and Senate elections when so many people who voted for it were out. This is not the state's money. And the only way to pass this and prevent a tax increase is to vote yes. Any Republican that votes not to do this is voting to raise your taxes, and they'll find themselves out come 2020 elections.
Okay. And
well, no, I don't disagree that if there is a windfall, first of all, we really don't know.
There's a windfall.
No, we don't. No, we don't.
Well,
there are so many changes.
If that's the case, how come Laura Kelly is counting on that money as part of her budget?
Look, we don't know in the end how that all shakes out. I mean, the Department of Revenue made it very clear last year. I had very many conversations throughout the session with Sam Williams, the Director of Revenue, talking about this issue because we don't know until people actually start paying exactly how it affects. And again, our first estimates in January are actually, we're seeing the revenue coming in way below the estimates. So it may actually be a negative number. But whatever that number is, you know, if there is a windfall, I agree we should give it back. But we have to give it back to where it helps the most Kansans, like reducing the sales tax on food, increasing the standard deduction, those kinds of things. Not put 71% of it back to large multinational.
I think the bottom line is,
gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt here because we do have other things we need to talk about. Other things about the budget, no less. So you have plenty of chance to debate here. The Kansas Senate this week also passed a bill that would make a $115 million payment to the state's pension fund, KPERS, that they skipped back in 2016. It's just one of many KPERS options under debate at the State House this session, and that has many state workers nervous, as I reported for Cake News earlier this week.
We've had a few calls. Retirees are always concerned about it.
The Wichita Teachers Union isn't alone. Some of you have reached out to us here at Cake News as well. The questions you're asking all revolve around what debates over KPERS funding mean for Kansas retirees or those nearing retirement.
There is a contractual agreement on the front end that I acknowledge that I may not be paid as much as I might be in the private industry, but that in the end there will be this guarantee, if you will, of a retirement income.
Steve Wins is the president of the Wichita Teachers Union. He's also nearing retirement himself. He says he's kept a close eye on the debates in Topeka. The two biggest right now include a vote Monday afternoon in the Senate over whether the state should make up some $115 million in overdue payments to the pension plan. The other, a plan to rework how the state finances KPERS, paying less now with an agreement to make payments for longer.
I think characterizing it in the idea of taking a 15-year mortgage and extending it to 30 years, a pretty good analogy.
This is the plan you've had the most questions about. For now, Wentz says it's unlikely to make any difference to current retirees or those nearing retirement. It's teachers who will retire closer to the payoff date, 10, 20 years down the road, who could be impacted if the state continues to delay making the payments it owes.
Our teachers who are 10 years or 15 years or less into their profession need to be engaged in this. The retirement thing is something that I think they should be paying more attention to. I should have probably when I was in my 30s.
Okay, so many questions that Kansans have about what's going on with capers. And I guess I'm going to start at the other end of the table this time with John, because you were making some comments during that story there. This is something that lawmakers had promised to do 3 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I think this, similar to the last one, comes down to where the priorities are. And, you know, for me, and from when I've talked to my listeners about this issue in particular, it seems like, well, frankly, it seems like the governor wants to spend money on her pet projects as opposed to on the debts and the obligations where Republicans and where I think the people of Kansas would rather see that money go. And so paying off your debts, paying off obligations, making sure that capers stay solvent, that's the thing that matters. And when you hear people equate this to, oh, it's just like refinancing your mortgage, I'm sorry, a $7 billion price tag, that's a heck of a refinance cost on your kids.
I think he was using that simply to make it understandable, because I know when this first came up, I had no idea what reamortization is.
Sure.
I had to talk to Stephen to figure it out, and he had to explain it to me. And I think it took about 3 explanations before I finally got it.
You're a quick study.
That's scary. But it is emblematic of how complicated all of this is with capers, and really the state has been in trouble with capers for a while now, but it's getting better, right, Stephen?
It absolutely has. And while there were things that we worked on 3 years ago, there were things that were worked on before I joined the legislature in 2011, and we formed a committee and a number of things on throughout the legislature to work on it. But truly, credit is due to a lot of people before my time in working on it. However, we have to look at what's happened. We've gone from millions to billions of dollars in debt, and we've done it by not making principal payments. Okay. We have failed to pay the interest since we took on debt in 1971, and we have to get over that hump however that works. The additional payment that was mentioned specifically, a great way to do it. Now, to retirees' benefits, which is the credit, this is what it's about, not at risk. We've got money to fund that for 30 years. We're in good shape. We just can't get behind the snowball, and we keep flirting with that. We have worked so hard to get out of, we dipped to 50% funded in the school group. We cannot be there. We've got to get to 80%. That's the problem with the reamortization. The additional $100 million is part of the solution. Just the interest alone on that amount is over $20,000 a day, just on that payment. And $100 million is a small part of $6.5 billion. But it's a great way to start turning that snowball the other way. And once you can start thawing it, we can melt it a lot faster.
Okay, I hate to short you, Tom, but we're already running out of time. So I have a very quick question for you. Can the governor's budget stand if the reamortization of capers does not happen?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's not a key part of her budget. The reamortization is, we've had a lot of problems with capers, as I mentioned. Over the last 9 years, there's been 15 instances where we've missed payments, delayed payments, or done reamortization. The layering is a form of reamortization. So the governor's proposal, this reamortization, is her kind of permanent solution. So we can quit missing payments, you know, her idea of stabilizing. You know, it's an idea that's out there. It's up to the legislature now to take that idea and work with it. And she's willing to work with other people to come up with the best solution. But we need to come up with a long-term fix, because the capers payments are going to get even worse, and we can't afford to keep missing payments or delaying payments.
And I have to disagree a bit here in that it works for the first 15 years, but you've got to look at that second 15 years, and that's what really concerns me.
And that's her proposal, but it's up to us now to take that and make changes or do something. But we've got to come up with a long-term solution. We got to quit this delaying and missing payments.
You're making my job so hard today, because these conversations are fascinating, but we got to move on. We're getting a new look at the damage from some of those prison riots last summer, along with a warning that things were worse than lawmakers thought. The Associated Press reports Kansas' new prison chief is suggesting the state correction system is in crisis. Take a look at these pictures he released of damage to the facilities at El Dorado and Larned prisons and injuries to the guards. Interim Corrections Secretary Roger Werholt says an increased use of double bunking inmates in cells, as well as overly aggressive transfers of inmates among prisons, were major factors in the riots at several facilities over the last 2 years. At the same time, the Corrections Department remains understaffed, expecting to keep at least 9% of its positions still open next year. Its overtime budget has ballooned from $1.7 million in 2013 to $8.2 million last year. Okay, and right back to that budget, what I found most interesting in all of that is how much more it's costing the state to have made these cuts in staffing. Can that be fixed, Stephen?
It can. Well, we've got two choices to make. The first one, we've got to figure out how to get away from the overtime. That's a lose for everybody. So how do we get to that correct staffing level? That takes resources. It takes a while to find the right people. It is critical because it's necessary for the prisons, the prisoners, but for the safety of our staff, it has to be a priority. So we've got two choices. We increase the resources to do what we're doing, or we change the desire of who we choose to incarcerate and reduce the demand on the system. But one of those has to happen in pretty short order.
Tom?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've got to increase pay for the workers at our correctional facilities. I mean, we've become this training ground now. We train them, and then they go to local law enforcement and make more money. Wow. So we've got to do a better job. They have very dangerous jobs. They do a tough job, and that is kind of the first thing we have to do. But we also have to look at prison reform. We've got to look at who's in the prison. Do we really? There's some people to be better off with drug treatment or in community settings than in a state prison, because your state prison's expensive. It's over $40,000 a year per prisoner. So we can find better ways, I think, to help rehabilitate people and actually give them better treatment. Sometimes when really they need treatment rather than incarceration in state prison actually makes it worse for everybody. It makes their lives worse, expensive for taxpayers. I think we really need to look at that. Okay,
so it sounds like to me that this is more a case of figuring out how, not an argument over what needs to happen here. And I'm going to move on. I'm sorry, John.
No, you're fine.
It's an issue that has plagued Sedgwick County for years, overcrowding at the jail there. Sound familiar? And now there could be a new issue. A man is asking the judge to throw out his case because he says his rights were violated. KSN's John Acebus explains.
As of today, our total population is 1,486 inmates.
The Sedgwick County Jail is slammed packed.
We're equipped here at the main jail housing facility, or the main jail here, for beds for 1,151 inmates.
Sheriff Jeff Easter says they have 286 more inmates than they can hold. Now, the county has been able to cut that number down thanks to the recently opened annex.
We have currently 175 people at the jail annex.
The sheriff says it saves the county and taxpayers money, but one of those inmates in the annex claims the new facility presented a new issue. The man's attorney says he wasn't able to see his client on site immediately and thus filed a motion to dismiss the case altogether. I asked prominent defense attorney Dan Monnett if issues like this are a concern.
We need to be able to see them in time to meaningfully prepare for trial, often on a daily basis.
It may be a new facility, but the sheriff tells me the policies are the same as the policies in the main jail. He says protecting the inmate and their rights is not an issue.
We don't allow attorneys to go in there because we don't have just an attorney-client booth. If they schedule with us ahead of time, we'll bring them back over to the main facility and we'll have them here for that meeting.
John Acebus, KSN News 3.
And this is just really a symptom of issues of overcrowding that we're seeing in county jails all across the state, which goes back to the same thing we were just talking about with the prisons and the budget. When I was speaking with Chief Gordon Ramsey, Wichita Police Chief, at the beginning of the year, one of the things that he mentioned to me is that the biggest problems that they're having are drugs and mental illness, that combination, and that getting those things treated ahead of time would keep as much as 70% of their population out of jail. So as we look at all of these issues, John, I want to start with you this time. What are some of the things that the folks that you speak with on your show are willing to see happen to deal with all this?
I think this comes down to, I think in particular it comes down to the essential function of government. funding law enforcement is. You know, one of the few times when I was in the legislature that I voted in favor of increasing government spending, it was on mental health and law enforcement funding. And, you know, I still serve as the chairman of CPOST. And one of the things that when I'm out at the Law Enforcement Training Center, they're constantly going through new classes. Part of the problem, the reason they have turnover, is because we're not paying our law enforcement enough. And that includes folks out, as Tom mentioned, corrections officers, guys out at the jail. Sheriff Easter, I know, is having that problem. So it is part and parcel to what we're paying. And when I can get a job, but then I can go over to Oklahoma, or I can go even within our own state and work at another county or work at the federal level and make more, that's a problem. So perhaps we need to look at prioritizing how we're spending our money and not necessarily throwing more money, but figuring out how to better use the money that we're currently spending.
That's certainly one of the debates we're going to be seeing going on at the State House this year. We kind of already talked about that with you too. So I'm just going to move on to our next topic now, because you guys are so fascinating. We keep running out of time. So Sedgwick County is in the process of hiring a county manager without doing a search for candidates. Instead, the commissioners are negotiating a contract with the interim manager, Tom Stoltz. KSN's Craig Andrus asked why no national search this time around.
Former county manager Michael Scholes recently fired by commissioners. Tom Stoltz has been the assistant county manager. Now commissioners are offering the job to Stoltz.
But there are people in the community who are waiting to apply.
Commissioner Howell saying the job should have been posted and open to the public. He says he is a big fan of Stoltz and did vote to offer him the position, but he says that job still should have been posted.
So again, I love the idea of having an open, transparent, equal opportunity process by which interested parties can apply and compete for these jobs, and really they should have that right to do that.
Other commissioners point out there is not a law dictating they have to post this job, and the county policy only suggests that they post the job publicly.
This is something that we've been battling up here, is how to move forward, what to do.
Commissioner O'Donnell says they all like the job Tom Stoltz has been doing as assistant county manager for years and now as interim manager, so the vote was unanimous. New Commissioner Pete Meitzner, who recently came on board, says it makes sense to move forward without posting the job publicly after Stoltz was vetted 3 years ago.
I didn't want to go out and ask business leaders and community leaders, hey, can you gather again 3 years later and go through the same exercise? It's the same resume, it's the same Tom.
And certainly Tom Stoltz is a well-known figure within Wichita, from his time in the police department to his time in county government. So there is that, but there's also the question of costs of national searches, and are they cost effective? I mean, certainly if paying, what is it, $200,000 or so for a national search gets you a candidate that's going to be around for a few years, great, but this last one was here for 3 years, and huge controversy surrounding him.
You know, to me, this is a local control issue. I mean, they know, I mean, it was a 5-0 vote, if I understand right, from the county commission.
Yeah. Bipartisan.
Bipartisan. You know, they know the guy, he knows county government. I mean, so if you got the person that you think is doing a good job and best qualified for the job, you know, I don't know that you need to spend the money on a national search. You might as well save that money if you got the right candidate and go forward. So I'm fine with what they're doing.
I would put the caveat, I do kind of agree with Jim in that I would have liked to have at least seen a local posting to allow for internal candidates or someone from the local business community. But I agree with Tom, they did spend a fair amount of money on the last one, and then a fair amount of money getting rid of the last one. Perhaps we could have at least put it out there and put it on ZipRecruiter or something. Right. But again, I think it's kind of like a whole lot of to do about nothing.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree, the local posting would have been a good idea, but the national search, there's no reason. If you got the best, if you got somebody that's doing a good job, promote them and go on.
Yeah, it seems like this is more about a case of the optics of what's going on and whether or not there's the appearance of some sort of, shall we call it, insider trading, which I don't think anybody who's worked with Tom Stoltz would think, but it's just, you know, the appearance of it, which is part of why so many governments do require national searches or regional searches. All right. Well, one last thing to talk about this week. The daughter of Wichita's BTK serial killer came out of the shadows. Carrie Rawson explained the grief she feels for her father's victims. She also talked about the horrible turn her life took upon learning of her father's double life. Rawson talked with Susan Peters in an exclusive local interview broadcast right here on KPTS.
We're on the street, your street, you grew up on, and you'd walk to school this way.
Right.
What do you feel like when you're on this street?
Well, now, I mean, it's the place where my dad was arrested, and like, you know, my mom was removed from her house, and then our house was torn down like 2 years later. So to me, it feels a lot like loss and grief here.
So the question keeps coming up over and over and over again, and 14, 15, 20 years later, it will still come up. How did you and your brother and your mother not have a clue that your father was BTK?
Because I hate that question. I get it all the time still from strangers. It makes me mad. You've lived with this man every day of your life, you know, up till you're 18 and then off and on till you're 26, okay? He's normally always just your dad. You know, occasionally he had a temper. A couple of times he was abusive. You know, he was just a temperamental man. I figured.
But you don't go from that to.
There's no way you would go from that to thinking he was a murderer.
And certainly for those of us who were in Wichita at the time, it was a time period in your life you just don't forget. I remember where I was, what I was doing when a reporter at the station that I was working at the time came in, called into the newsroom and said, "You need to get somebody to Park City. They're about to make an arrest." It's not something that Kansans forget. Certainly, we all have those memories. What are some of the things you guys remember from it? John?
You know, I like you, I remember when they made the arrest. I remember watching the trial, the bits of the trial that I was able to catch at the time, and you know, how well that was handled. Nola Folston, you know, took that, reins of that. Kevin O'Connor, I think Judge O'Connor was involved with that as well. You know, it's so interesting when you watch stories like this when they come back. I feel for her. People think about the victims. She's a victim, as much a victim in many ways.
His entire family.
Right, and so I think you have to have sympathy there too. And I just, as I've watched the bits that you guys have previewed of this, I'm sympathetic towards what she has gone through and the persecution that she's received.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine being a family member and you find out your father or husband, whatever, was doing these horrible killings. The thing that at the time that started, you know, they'd gone on for so many years, didn't know who it was, and then at the end there, it seemed to go pretty fast. It was, you know,
it did. That last year was boom,
almost like
very
he wanted
fast.
to get
Right.
Yeah.
So
all right.
that's the thing I really remember.
Okay, so if you want to see more about that interview, all you have to do is check KPTS. It's coming up in a few minutes following this show. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it, and I hope you have enjoyed the show as well. The BTK special is on channel 8.2. For now, have a great week.